can't tell you about it now, darling. But I want you to know this. I do love you, and that's the most important thing in the world.
There has always been something about film sets that made people forget their existing commitments. Long hours, shared intensity, the artificial intimacy of playing opposite someone day after day. The conditions were almost designed to produce exactly what they produced. These are 12 Golden Age actors who cheated with their co-stars. And in most cases, the whole world found out about it. Number 12. Clark Gable and Joan Crawford. Their on-screen chemistry in the early 1930s was not invented. Clark Gable and Joan Crawford worked together across a series of MGM films: Dance, Fools, Dance in 1931, Laughing Sinners in 1931, Possessed in 1931, Dancing Lady in 1933, and the specific quality of what happened between them on screen reflected what was happening off it with a directness that the studio's publicity machine worked to manage rather than eliminate. Gable was married to Rhea Langham at the time, his second wife, a socialite whose age and social connections had helped his career, but whose marriage was already functionally over in practice, if not on paper. Crawford was married to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., whose family name was one of the most celebrated in Hollywood, and whose father had built United Artists with Chaplin and Griffith and Pickford. Both marriages were casualties of the same force. Crawford has spoken about her relationship with Gable in several interviews across her career, describing it as one of the most intense romantic experiences of her life, and as something that both of them understood could not be sustained publicly. Gable's subsequent marriage to Carole Lombard, the woman he described as the love of his life, and his grief after her death in 1942, suggest that whatever he and Crawford had was genuine, but not the thing he was ultimately looking for. MGM was aware of the affair and managed it with the systematic efficiency it applied to all threats to its commercial properties. Both Gable and Crawford were too valuable to the studio for either to be allowed to suffer professionally from the personal situation. The studio's publicity apparatus constructed and maintained a narrative about both of them that the press, operating under the informal agreements of the era, largely reproduced without significant challenge. Clark Gable died on November 16, 1960 in Los Angeles at the age of 59. Joan Crawford died on May 10, 1977 in New York at the age of 72. Number 11. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Spencer Tracy was married to Louise Treadwell in 1923 and never divorced her. That is the complete legal fact of the situation. The complete emotional fact is that from 1941 until his death in 1967, the central relationship of his life was with Katharine Hepburn, whom he met during the filming of Woman of the Year and who remained his companion, his support, and, by all accounts, his truest domestic partner for 26 years. Born on April 5, 1900 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Tracy had come to film through theater and built a reputation for naturalistic performance that made his acting the benchmark against which other actors measured themselves. He had also been essentially separated from Louise for years before he met Hepburn. They lived apart. They maintained the marriage for reasons that combined his Catholic faith with the specific social calculus of a decade in which divorce still carried meaningful professional consequences for major studio stars. The affair, if it can be called that after its first decade of existence, was entirely open within Hollywood and managed carefully in relation to the general press. Hepburn herself has spoken about the arrangement in her memoir and in interviews with a directness that acknowledged both the love and the specific limitation that Tracy's refusal to divorce imposed on it. She accepted the limitation, the absence of public acknowledgement, the position of the woman who was there, but not officially there, as the price of the relationship, and she paid it for a quarter century. They made 9 films together across those years, Woman of the Year in 1942, Keeper of the Flame in 1942, Without Love in 1945, The Sea of Grass in 1947, State of the Union in 1948, Adam's Rib in 1949, Pat and Mike in 1952, Desk Set in 1957, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967, the last of which Tracy completed 17 days before his death. Hepburn was present throughout the production of that final film and absent from his bedside when he died. Louise was there. Spencer Tracy died on June 10, 1967, in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 67. Number 10. Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Humphrey Bogart was 44 years old and married to actress Mayo Methot, his third wife, in a relationship so volatile that their social circle had nicknamed them the Battling Bogarts. When Lauren Bacall arrived on the set of To Have and Have Not in 1944. Bacall was 19 years old. Director Howard Hawks had discovered her on the cover of Harper's Bazaar and cast her in the lead opposite Bogart. And what happened between them on camera was visible enough in the early dailies that Hawks stopped trying to manage it and simply filmed what was happening. Born Humphrey DeForest Bogart in New York City on December 25, 1899, Bogart had spent his entire adult life accumulating and disposing of marriages with a consistency that might have suggested he was not temperamentally suited to the institution. He had married 3 times before Bacall, to actress Helen Menken in 1926, to actress Mary Phillips in 1928, and to Methot in 1938. None of those marriages had produced a relationship that he described with anything resembling the warmth he brought to his accounts of Bacall. Bacall was born Betty Joan Persky in New York City on September 16, 1924, and had been in Hollywood for approximately 15 minutes when To Have and Have Not began shooting. The confidence she displayed on set, the famous scene where she tells Bogart's character how to whistle, was both performed and real. She knew what was happening between them, and she was not particularly inclined to pretend otherwise. Bogart divorced Methot and married Bacall in May 1945, 11 days after the divorce was finalized. Their marriage lasted until his death from esophageal cancer on January 14, 1957. 12 years that the people who knew them described as the most functional and genuinely affectionate relationship of his adult life. They had 2 children together, Stephen Humphrey Bogart, born in 1949, and Leslie Howard Bogart, born in 1952. Lauren Bacall died on August 12, 2014, in New York, at the age of 89. Number 9. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. The affair between Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor during the production of Cleopatra in Rome in 1962 is the benchmark against which all subsequent Hollywood on-set romances have been measured. Both were married. Both were among the most photographed people in the world. Both were in Rome with an international press corps that had little better to do than document exactly what was happening between them. And what was happening was impossible to miss. Burton was born Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. in Pontrhydyfen, Wales, on November 10, 1925, and had come to Hollywood from a stage career of considerable distinction. He was married to Sybil Williams, who had stayed with him through a decade of infidelities. The Welsh theatre world and the London stage community were well aware of his behavior, and who apparently believed this one would resolve itself the way the others had. Taylor had already been married 3 times, to Nicky Hilton, to Michael Wilding, and to Mike Todd, and was married to her 4th husband, singer Eddie Fisher, when the Cleopatra production began. She had stolen Fisher from Debbie Reynolds 3 years earlier, which had made her one of the most publicly condemned women in America, and she appeared to have developed a specific immunity to public condemnation as a result. The Vatican issued a statement describing Taylor's conduct as erotic vagrancy, which she received, by multiple accounts, with considerable amusement. The photographs of Burton and Taylor together on the set circulated across Europe and America for months. Sybil Williams divorced Burton in 1963. Taylor divorced Fisher the same year. Burton and Taylor married in Montreal in March 1964, divorced in 1974, remarried briefly in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. Richard Burton died on August 5, 1984, in Séligny, Switzerland, at the age of 58. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, in Los Angeles, at the age of 79. Number 8. Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal. Gary Cooper was 47 years old and married to Veronica Balfe, known as Rocky, married to Cooper since December 1933, when he met Patricia Neal during the pre-production of The Fountainhead in 1948. Neal was 22 years old, a recent arrival in Hollywood from a stage career in New York, and described in every account of the production as someone who recognized immediately that the relationship developing between her and Cooper was serious. Born Frank James Cooper in Helena, Montana, on May 7, 1901, Cooper had a romantic history that significantly predated his marriage. Clara Bow, Lupe Velez, the Countess de Frasso, and a marriage to Rocky that was stable in certain respects and understood by both of them to be complicated in others. Rocky knew about the affair with Neal. The knowledge did not produce a divorce. It produced a refusal to grant one, applied with the firmness of someone who understood exactly what leverage she held and was prepared to use it. Patricia Neal, born in Packard, Kentucky on January 20, 1926, has described the relationship in her memoir, As I Am, with a candor that makes clear how completely she believed Cooper was going to leave Rocky for her. She moved in that belief for several years before the refusal became clear enough that she had to accept it. The breakdown she suffered in the aftermath of the relationship's end was serious enough to require medical attention, and she addressed it in later years with the same directness she brought to the memoir. Cooper returned to his marriage and his career. High Noon in 1952, his second Academy Award for Best Actor, without public acknowledgement of what the relationship had cost anyone. Neal went on to her own Oscar-winning career, including HUD in 1963, and married writer Roald Dahl in 1953. Their marriage lasted until 1983. Gary Cooper died on May 13, 1961, in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 60. Patricia Neal died on August 8, 2010, in Edgerton, Massachusetts, at the age of 84. Number 7. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner. Frank Sinatra's affair with Ava Gardner began while he was married to Nancy Barbado, the childhood sweetheart he had married in February 1939, and who had built her life around the marriage and around supporting his career through its lean early years and its extraordinary rise. By the late 1940s, the career had produced a fame that Sinatra navigated with very little discipline, and Gardner was the consequence that Nancy had not planned for. Born Francis Albert Sinatra in Hoboken, New Jersey, on December 12, 1915, Sinatra pursued Gardner across continents with a persistence that was publicly documented in the press of 3 countries. Gardner was herself not married at the time they began their affair. She had been married to Mickey Rooney from 1942 to 1943 and to bandleader Artie Shaw from 1945 to 1946. But Sinatra was, and the pursuit was conducted with a disregard for that fact that made concealment both impossible and apparently undesired. Born Ava Lavinia Gardner in Grabtown, North Carolina, on December 24, 1922, Gardner had come to Hollywood through a chance encounter and an MGM contract, and by the late 1940s, was one of the studio's most commercially reliable stars. Her relationship with Sinatra was not a casual affair. It was, by the testimony of both of them, across decades of subsequent interviews, the central romantic experience of both their lives, and the inability of either of them to sustain a life with the other was one of the defining failures of both their personal biographies. Sinatra divorced Nancy in 1951 and married Gardner the same year. The marriage lasted until 1957, producing the same volatility and intensity that the affair had promised. Gardner later described Sinatra as the love of her life. Sinatra said the same. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998 in Los Angeles at the age of 82. Ava Gardner died on January 25, 1990 in London at the age of 67. Number 6. Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. Ingrid Bergman was the most respected actress in Hollywood when the scandal broke. The woman who had played a nun in The Bells of St. Mary's, who had played Joan of Arc on screen, whose entire public image was built on a quality of moral integrity and personal virtue that the fan magazines had been cultivating for a decade. The revelation that she had left her husband and daughter for Italian director Roberto Rossellini and was pregnant with his child produced a congressional denunciation on the floor of the United States Senate. Born on August 29, 1915 in Stockholm, Sweden, Bergman had come to Hollywood in 1939 at David O. Selznick's invitation and built her American career through Casablanca in 1942, For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943, Gaslight in 1944, for which she won her first Academy Award, and The Bells of St. Mary's in 1945. She was married to Swedish physician Petter Lindström, with whom she had a daughter, Pia. She wrote Rossellini a letter in 1949, expressing admiration for his film Paisa and saying she would like to work with him. He responded. She went to Italy to make Stromboli in 1949. What followed was one of the most documented ruptures between a public image and a private life in the history of American entertainment. She became pregnant by Rossellini while still married to Lindström. Senator Edwin Johnson of Colorado denounced her on the Senate floor as a horrible example of womanhood and called for her to be barred from the United States. She was effectively blacklisted in Hollywood for 7 years. She worked in Europe with Rossellini. They married after her divorce from Lindström and had 3 children together, including actress Isabella Rossellini, and returned to American film in 1956 with Anastasia, for which she won her second Academy Award. Ingrid Bergman died on August 29, 1982, in London at the age of 67 from breast cancer. Number 5. Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier. Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier were both married to other people when their affair began in 1937, and both were aware that the affair would have consequences that extended beyond the personal. Olivier was married to actress Jill Esmond. Leigh was married to barrister Herbert Lee Holman. Both marriages ended. The affair produced one of the most celebrated theatrical and cinematic partnerships of the 20th century. Born Vivian Mary Hartley in Darjeeling, India, on November 5, 1913, Leigh had been working in British film and theater when she met Olivier during the production of Fire Over England in 1937. He was 3 years older, already established as one of the most important stage actors in England, and entirely aware of what he was looking at. Born Lawrence Kerr, Olivier in Dorking, Surrey, on May 22, 1907, Olivier had built a stage reputation that was already on its way to becoming the most celebrated in the English-speaking world. His film work, Wuthering Heights in 1939, Rebecca in 1940, Henry V in 1944, ran parallel to a theatrical career that set the standard for classical performance across 4 decades. Leigh and Olivier married in August 1940 after their respective divorces were finalized. Their marriage lasted until 1960, 20 years, and was shaped by Leigh's mental illness which was eventually diagnosed as bipolar disorder, and by Olivier's affair with actress Joan Plowright, whom he married after his divorce from Lee. The two of them in partnership, she as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind in 1939, he as Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights the same year, both at the absolute peak of the era's film production, constituted one of the great years any couple has had in the history of cinema. Vivien Leigh died on July 8, 1967 in London at the age of 53. Laurence Olivier died on July 11, 1989 in Steyning, West Sussex at the age of 82. Number 4. Rex Harrison and Carol Landis. Rex Harrison was married to actress Lily Palmer and filming Unfaithfully Yours in 1948 when his affair with Carol Landis became the most talked about story in Hollywood. The affair was conducted without particular discretion. Harrison was not prepared to leave Palmer for Landis. On July 5, 1948, Landis died by suicide at her home in Bel Air, California. Harrison was the person who found her body. Born Reginald Carey Harrison in Houghton, Lancashire, England, on March 5, 1908, Harrison had established himself as one of the finest light comedic actors of his generation through a career that moved between London, Broadway, and Hollywood. Major Barbara in 1941, Blithe Spirit in 1945, and Anna and the King of Siam in 1946 had given him a professional standing that the scandal surrounding Landis's death damaged without destroying. Born Frances Lillian Mary Ridsty in Fairport Harbor, Ohio, on January 1, 1919, Landis had built a Hollywood career through the early 1940s that included 1 Million BC in 1940 and Topper Returns in 1941. She was 29 years old when she died. The press coverage of her death was extensive, unflattering to Harrison, and followed him in every biographical account written about him since. He left the United States for Britain shortly after the inquest. He continued working. His career survived with the resilience that the careers of men in similar situations typically survived, and was married 6 times in total. His most celebrated role, Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady, came first on Broadway in 1956, and then in the 1964 film that won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. Rex Harrison died on June 2, 1990 in New York City at the age of 82 from pancreatic cancer. Number 3. Marlon Brando and Tarita Teripaya. Marlon Brando was married to his second wife, Movita Castaneda, a Mexican actress he had married in June 1960, while still technically married to his first wife, Anna Kashfi, a bigamous situation that the subsequent legal proceedings addressed. When he arrived in Tahiti to film Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962, he met Tarita Teripaya, a French-Polynesian actress cast as the female lead, and the relationship that developed during the production became the foundation for the third and final phase of his domestic life. Born on April 3, 1924 in Omaha, Nebraska, Brando had by this point established the pattern that defined his personal biography: intense initial commitment, professional and personal chaos, and a transition to the next relationship before the previous one had been formally resolved. Kashfi and Brando had divorced in 1959 after a custody battle over their son Christian that was conducted publicly and with mutual ferocity. The marriage to Movita had followed with a speed that Kashfi's attorneys found legally problematic. Born Tarita Teripaya in Bora Bora, French Polynesia, on December 29, 1941, she was 20 years old when she met Brando on the Mutiny on the Bounty set in the Society Islands. He was 37. The production itself was already one of the most troubled in MGM's history, dramatically over budget, plagued by weather delays, and generating production reports about Brando's behavior that the studio used for years afterward to justify declining to employ him. Whatever chaos surrounded the production, the relationship that came out of it was genuine enough to last beyond it. Brando's purchase of the Tetiaroa Atoll in French Polynesia, 12 islands he bought for his use and eventually developed as an eco-resort, was directly connected to his time in Tahiti during that production and represented one of the most significant commitments he made to any place or person outside of his working life. He spent substantial periods there across the following 3 decades. He married Tarita in 1962. They had 2 children together, Tehotu in 1963 and Cheyenne in 1970, before divorcing in 1972. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004 in Los Angeles at the age of 80. Number 2, Errol Flynn and his leading ladies. Errol Flynn's on-set relationships with his co-stars were so consistent a feature of his productions that directors and studio executives eventually factored them into the production planning as a standard operating condition rather than a crisis to be managed. The question was not whether Flynn would pursue the women he was working with, but which of them would require the most careful handling of the aftermath. Born in Hobart, Tasmania on June 20th, 1909, Flynn arrived in Hollywood already in possession of the appetites and the approach that defined his career. His marriages, to Lily DeMita in 1935, to Nora Eddington in 1943, and to Patrice Wymore in 1950, were each conducted alongside relationships that the studio managed with the thoroughness that his commercial value justified and that his behavior continuously required. The names that appear most consistently in accounts of his on-set relationships include Olivia de Havilland, his co-star across 8 films from 1935 to 1941, with whom a sustained mutual attraction produced one of the most documented unrequited or not relationships in the history of the studio era. De Havilland was careful, private, and Catholic, 3 qualities that created a specific kind of friction with Flynn's approach to those same subjects. She has addressed the question of whether the attraction became a physical relationship with a consistency of careful non-answer that has sustained speculation across many decades. His relationship with actress Alexis Smith during the production of Gentleman Jim in 1942 and with other co-stars across his Warner Brothers career were managed with the specific apparatus that Warner Brothers maintained for exactly that purpose. Flynn's own account of these relationships in his autobiography was characteristically selective, candid enough to be entertaining, evasive enough to avoid specifics that might have required legal or financial consequences. Errol Flynn died on October 14, 1959, in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the age of 50. Number 1, Charlie Chaplin and Paulette Goddard. Charlie Chaplin's relationship with Paulette Goddard, which began sometime in the early 1930s, produced 2 significant films and resulted in a marriage whose very existence was managed with the ambiguity that characterized Chaplin's approach to most public commitments, is the most deliberately obscure relationship on this list. Not because the participants were particularly secretive by nature, but because Chaplin's legal and professional situation by the mid-1930s made clarity about his domestic arrangements an active professional liability. Born Charles Spencer Chaplin in London on April 16, 1889, Chaplin had by the early 1930s already produced 2 marriages that had ended in extensive press coverage and expensive legal proceedings. His divorce from Lita Gray in 1927, which produced a legal complaint of such specificity that it was banned as obscene in several jurisdictions, had taught him something about the cost of allowing his personal arrangements to be publicly defined in ways he could not control. Born Pauline Marion Levy in Whitestone, New York, on June 3, 1910, Goddard had come to Hollywood after a brief early marriage and was working as an extra and small part actress when she met Chaplin around 1932. He cast her in Modern Times in 1936, in which her physical energy and comedic instinct were exactly what the film required, and then in The Great Dictator in 1940, where she played the female lead opposite his dual performance as the Jewish barber and the dictator Hinkle. Whether they were married before The Great Dictator, and when, and where, was a question that Chaplin declined to answer with specificity for years, and that Goddard declined to answer with the same artful vagueness. The most credible accounts suggest they were married in 1936, possibly on his yacht off the coast of China, in a ceremony that left no documentary record that either party was inclined to produce. They separated around 1940 and divorced in 1942. The ambiguity served Chaplin professionally. When he was accused of moral turpitude in the early 1940s, the absence of a clear marriage record created legal and public complications that a simple yes or no might have resolved. It served neither of them personally, and Goddard moved on to a successful subsequent career and a marriage to writer Erich Maria Remarque in 1958 that lasted until his death in 1970. Charlie Chaplin died on December 25, 1977, in Corsier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, at the age of 88. The set has always been its own world, with its own rules, its own intimacies, and its own specific conditions for producing exactly the kind of attachments that the people on this list produced. The intensity of shared work, the manufactured emotion of playing opposite someone day after day, the isolation from ordinary life that location shooting created, all of it contributed to a pattern that repeated itself across every studio, every decade, and every set of circumstances that the Golden Age could produce. Some of those relationships lasted a lifetime. Some ended badly. Most ended in the complicated middle ground, where the truth about any romantic situation usually lives, with genuine feeling, genuine damage, and the specific quality of something that was real in its moment and impossible to sustain outside it. If this kind of Hollywood history is what brings you here, hit that like button and subscribe. There is a lot more coming.